The town of El Zonte is ground zero for Bitcoin adoption in El Salvador. It's a town of just a few thousand people. It's often referred to as Bitcoin Beach, which is the namesake of the Bitcoin Beach wallet developed by Galoy. So today I had a chance to sit down with Galoy's co-founder, Chris Hunter, and we talked a lot about how Galoy helped develop the Bitcoin Beach wallet, how it's being used today, El Salvador's acceptance and adoption of the Lightning Network, and how Galoy is going to be enabling all sorts of communities of all different sizes all over the world to onboard to Bitcoin using their banking as a service business model. I learned a ton from the conversation. I'm sure you will too. If you have any questions along the way, feel free to send me a question over the Lightning Network. You can download a Lightning podcasting app like Fountain and fire off a message. I will be answering them all in the lightning round at the end of the show. Welcome to the show, Chris Hunter. Why don't you start off by talking to me a little bit about Galoy's origin story, your involvement in it, and maybe even before that, how did you first come to realize the Lightning Network was going to be an important innovation in the kind of broader Bitcoin space?
Sure. I mean, well, thank you for having me, first of all, and lots to unpack there, even with that series of initial questions. So, from my personal perspective, I'm an engineer by training, built a number of companies in years past in the renewable energy industry, and then went down the Bitcoin rabbit hole 8 years ago. And, even back then in the 2014 timeframe, for me, it was pretty clear that Bitcoin was one of the most important technologies ever invented for humanity, full stop. And, that Bitcoin a long time ago had won the battle to be internet native digital money over IP, if you will. And so, that's the context that I've had for a number of years. And, I think people erroneously compare, Bitcoin, when they read Satoshi's white paper and see peer-to-peer electronic cash, they erroneously compare Bitcoin to Visa or Bitcoin to PayPal, right? And they say Bitcoin is a failure because it's only 7 transactions per second. And, we published a thesis where we compare Bitcoin to Fedwire, where, all final settlement of US dollars happens, and we can unpack the details there. But, if you have that frame that Nicholas, my co-founder, and I have had for a number of years where, Bitcoin, the protocol is a settlement layer, and that just like we built layers on top of Fedwire post-World War II in terms of commercial banks and then credit cards and ATM networks and things thereafter, something similar would evolve on Bitcoin. And this seems completely obvious to me. The world doesn't seem to get this yet, and it's really strange to me because it seems just so easy to see based upon how the financial system in years past evolved. And so, to come back to your question, if you have the frame that I just articulated, then it seems patently obvious that something like Lightning needed to be developed in order to have a layer 2 and a layer 3 and a layer 4 on top of Bitcoin. And so, that's kind of why we became so excited about Lightning so early, is because it was kind of patently obvious that the world would evolve in that way.
Interesting. So in the context of like the fiat financial system, how many of those layers do you see right now, and how many do you think will be replicated on a Bitcoin standard? Do you think that, like you mentioned, layer 2, 3, 4, how high does that chain go today, and how high could it go on Bitcoin?
I mean, the short answer is I don't know, although I'm willing to hazard a guess. And maybe I'll just take a very brief moment to describe the traditional financial system, which I kind of got at. I mean, most people don't even know that Fedwire exists, right? And Fedwire is run by the Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States government, right? And that's where all final settlement of US dollars happens, whether you're swiping a credit card or sending a wire transfer, that settlement happens there. And Fedwire, is a closed private members club. There's only about 9,000 entities that have access to Fedwire, right? You and I don't have access. It only operates a limited number of hours per week, right? You have final settlement there, typically 3 to 5 days after the initial transaction happens, right? It's not extensible in any way. And the Bitcoin protocol is completely different, right? Bitcoin protocol operates 24/7, 365. It doesn't discriminate. It's open to everybody in the world who has an internet connection, right? You have final settlement on Bitcoin basically after 3 confirmations, right? 30 minutes, as opposed to 3 to 5 business days, right? And Bitcoin is fully extensible, right? We have Lightning and all these layers that we'll build on top of it, right? And so if you understand that, and this is the thesis that we published, my partner Nicholas and I back in July of 2020, which everybody's free to read on Medium, once you understand that, it's just completely obvious that Bitcoin is going to destroy the traditional financial system once we start to build these layers on top of the base layer. Just like with the base layer of Fedwire, we built commercial banks and then credit cards and ATM networks. There's not a direct analogy, but history rhymes, right? It doesn't repeat. And so we're going to build layers on top of Bitcoin. And then there's another analogy. We built layers on top of the internet protocols that were given in 1983, HTTP, SMTP, FTP. If we were sitting here in 1995 talking to an internet technologist and you described what Amazon or Netflix or Facebook enables on the internet, most of them would have said that's not possible on a base layer like HTTP. But we bastardized HTTP I use that word in a positive way, to get all this magic flowing over a kind of a base layer protocol that most viewed as not very robust, right? Bitcoin, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to build these layers. So how high does it go? I don't know, but it's going to be more than layer 2. Layer 2 is where we're at now, but it's going to go further in the future.
Are there any applications you can point to right now that you think Lightning doesn't solve for that Bitcoin needs? Like any holes in the market that Lightning cannot quite handle right now?
For sure, a lot, right? It's still super early days for Lightning, let alone anything that might be built at a higher level, right? And so, what we're focused on at Galoy is building Bitcoin banking infrastructure. Our goal is to become the number one company in the world to make it easy for people to use Bitcoin as money, right? Now, there's other applications that will be built on Bitcoin with Lightning and other layers that are not necessarily related to money per se, but in terms of just freedom of communication, right? And there's kind of an infinite vision that we can have for Lightning and other layers of the future. But even just with a simple kind of straightforward application of Bitcoin as money, we're very proud of what we've built at Galoy. We're proud of our proof of concept, which is the Bitcoin Beach Wallet, which we can talk about, and provides real functionality, but it's still janky. Every day there's bugs, there's things that should work that don't, and we and others in the ecosystem who are building on Lightning are learning by doing. So to come back to your question, there's tremendous gaps that need to be filled and will be filled in terms of product and services that we and others will bring to the market. It's still super early, so kind of need to take it in context.
Makes sense. So let's go back to Galoy and talk specifically about like the beginning of the Bitcoin Beach wallet and the whole Bitcoin Beach project in El Salvador. How did that all come together? Can you tell me the backstory of that?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. So my partner Nicholas and I came together in late 2019. And then, as I mentioned, we published our thesis in the early summer of 2020. And that same summer, about 18 months ago, I went to all the fancy VCs to try to raise a round of capital. And all the top VCs who understand Bitcoin, many of whom I had previously already had a long-standing relationship, having been an angel investor myself in the space. And we kind of got 3 universal pieces of feedback. Number 1, we love you and Nicholas as a team. Number 2, we totally believe your thesis. We think it's awesome and believe the world is going to evolve in a way where we have these layers built on Bitcoin, just like we had layers built on Fedwire. And number 3, we're not giving you any money whatsoever because we think you were 5 years too early to build on Lightning, right? And so we kind of walked away with our tail between our legs. Literally every VC rejected us, which led us to El Salvador in August of 2020. We had heard about the Bitcoin Beach project led by Mike Peterson and Jorge Chimbera. We had read about them in Forbes magazine. And we just cold called them, right? We said, hey, you've got this project. Seems like you got a little bit of momentum. You don't have a good tech stack. Let us build pro bono for you a tech stack in terms of a community bank, right? Both the mobile wallet, which we have, as well as a novel shared custody multi-sig backend, right? And we built infrastructure from scratch for them using our own dollars because no VCs would give us money and our time and energy. And that's kind of the origin story of how we ended up in El Salvador starting in September of 2020.
Right. That's really cool. And so from there, how the Bitcoin Beach wallet expanded in the last year? Because in just, I guess, the last 6 months, El Salvador has gone through this really big transition of knowing nothing about Bitcoin across the country to everyone's going to be using Bitcoin. It's legal tender everywhere. How has that transition changed the work you do at Galoy? I'm sure you've seen a change in the number of users and just like the overall impact of the project, but would love to learn more about exactly how El Salvador's recent change has kind of changed your business.
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a lot to unpack there. So I'll break it up into a couple of different pieces, kind of pre-presidential announcement from Bukele in first week of June and post, right? And so, we ended up in El Salvador in September of 20. we kind of launched a very crude alpha of the wallet in October of 20, but for all intents and purposes, we had a real useful wallet, a beta version, if you will, launched in January of this year, January of 2021, right? And keep in mind, to give people, your listeners, some context, we launched in El Zante, which is a town of 3,000 people, about 2,000 adults on the Pacific coast of El Salvador. And it's a relatively impoverished area, right? The average wage is, call it $400 US per month, which for a town of 2,000 adults means the GDP is about 800,000 US dollars per month. It's, very, very modest income, for that region. And we, having launched in real terms in January of this year, we saw some pretty impressive growth. Keep in mind, there's no legal entity here, right? There's no management team. There's no capitalization of this entity. And it all just kind of grew word of mouth through local education. And by May of this year, which was before the presidential announcement, we had, something that felt like 6,000 weekly active users, right? So this had spread well beyond El Zante, right? There's only 2,000 adults in the town to begin with, right? And in the month of May, to give you some degree of scale, we probably had more than $1 million US dollars notional moving through the system. This is all Lightning transactions. This is not on-chain, right? This is all for local goods and services, not remittance. So this is people buying pupusas and sodas, or a meal at a local hostel, or whatever the case might be, right? This was literally a postcard from the future, given less than a year beforehand, all the VCs told us we were 5 years too early, right? And so this had kind of already spread, through a good portion of the country, right? Given that 6,000 active users were there in May. And then when Bukele made the announcement first week of June, it grew 10x overnight, right? It just literally blew up. And we were running all this on one single Lightning node. And Nicholas, my partner, I know he had some sleepless nights just making sure things didn't break, because even at that point in the story, it was me, him, and one software engineer we were paying out of our own pockets. And that was it. That was the entire Galoy team at that point in time. And so, I'll pause there in case you have any questions, but then we can get to the second part of the story, which is post-presidential announcement, how have things evolved over the last 6 months?
Yeah, that's incredible to see the growth of having more people than the entire community of El Zante using the app before any of this announcement, and then and more dollar volume, right? Like you said, it was $1 million a month. Was that?
Yeah, in the month of May, the insight you actually completed my thought, which I didn't get to, so thank you for that. Like in the month of May, we probably had more than the monthly GDP in actual transactions that month moving through the wallet, which, for people who have never had a bank account using a completely novel technology, is pretty awesome to see. The insight is there was some real degree of scale, even in this relatively, modest income area.
And then you said the month after that, you basically 10x'd.
Yeah, it was a spike that, as you might expect, kind of tapered off, thereafter. But yeah, we saw something approaching, 50,000 active users in the month of June, which was pretty impressive.
And that was when the first announcement came out that El Salvador would undertake this legal tender Bitcoin kind of law and put that into place.
That's right.
Tell me then about from June to September, in that kind of phase of like, El Salvador is going to be doing this, but it's not quite law yet. I think the law went into effect September 7th. What was that transition period like? Obviously, a lot of the country was onboarding to Bitcoin. There must have been a lot of education involved and a lot of infrastructure building in the country. Can you shine a light on exactly how that unfolded and how El Salvador made the transition from no Bitcoin adoption outside of basically Bitcoin Beach to the whole country?
Sure. Well, actually, your instinct is right, but it was actually just the opposite. There was basically no education happening and no infrastructure being built, which kind of led to Nicholas and I, even though we had no free time and have never organized a conference before, we decided to organize in country the Adopting Bitcoin Summit in November. And the insight there is, in like mid to late June, there was kind of a pilgrimage of lots of Bitcoiners. They went to El Salvador, they went to El Zante, right? They all tooled around town, and that really died off in early July once you got past the hype. And, Nicholas and I were on the ground in El Salvador in July and August, and it was kind of shocking because we were meeting with, the bank CEOs, other business leaders, other government leaders, and even, 6-8 weeks after the presidential announcement, when people knew they had a legal obligation to accept Bitcoin as tender and banks knew that they had to deal with this, the level of the lack of understanding regarding Bitcoin was shocking. And I'm not even talking about like the CEO himself or herself, that you might be okay, like their CEO, they're distracted by other things, but even talking to the chief technical officers of some of these banks, right? They didn't know the first thing about Bitcoin, let alone Lightning or anything else. And that was shocking. And that's what led us to decide, on 3 months' notice to organize the Adopting Bitcoin Lightning Summit, because two main reasons. One, there hadn't been a global Lightning Summit since July of 19, 2 years beforehand in Berlin. And two, we felt it was important to organize in country and bring together leading Bitcoiners from around the world in country to educate the local population, both kind of just the average populace as well as all these business leaders. And that's what gave birth to us announcing on August 30th that we would host the Lightning Summit in November, which was a very well-received 3-day event where we had 700 people from 30 different countries attend. And so, I would have asked the same question. It was like, oh, how was the education? How was the infrastructure rollout in summertime? But it's non-existent. And we can talk about the launch of Chivo on September 7th and how that was kind of, on one hand, impressive what they pulled off on 90 days, but on the other hand, still didn't really work and still doesn't work today, right? And then what we've seen with our wallet and other third-party private wallets and how those have kind of filled the gap in recent months. Yeah,
I would love to dive into that. Do you think that the banks and the CEOs and CTOs that you mentioned not really understanding it early on in July and August, do you think they have now come around to understanding it? Do you think they've ramped up well now that the Adopting Bitcoin conference has happened? They've been under this like Bitcoin legal tender system for a few months. Is that starting to change today?
It is changing, right? I don't think it's changing as swiftly as you might even expect now that the law was announced more than 6 months ago, and it went into effect more than 3 months ago. To be a bit cheeky about things, reading between the lines, I think a lot of these bank and other company executives, just business people in El Salvador, just thought this would be a flash in the pan, right? That like, okay, Bukele made this announcement, but like, we're not really going to have to deal with it. Today, what are we, December 21st, December 22nd, whatever today's date is, like they know they have to deal with it, whether they like it or not. They're still not really prepared to deal with it, but they know this is a reality that's not going away, right? Chivo is kind of, Chivo to Chivo wallet transactions work, whether it's an individual to another individual or an individual's wallet to a merchant Chivo wallet, right? But a lot of that's because it's on-chain or not on-chain intra-ledger entries, right? Just in a back-end database. Until very recently, Lightning transactions in Chivo basically didn't work. My best guess is because they were actually batching Lightning transactions like twice per day, which is completely nonsensical given what Lightning is supposed to be, right? And so we can talk about, what they try to stitch together with Chivo or what, Bitcoin Beach Wallet or others in market have done on a third-party basis. But it's getting better, but, it's still like super early days for a country trying to use Bitcoin as money.
Yeah. And now all these banks have to deal with wallets being competitors now, right? Like this is just a new set of competitors that they've never had to deal with before. And Chivo, to some degree, like they are now a competitor as a wallet, right? And banks never had to deal with El Salvador being a competitor to them, to their business, right? So how does the fact that like banks can be wallets, how does that change the competitive landscape for moving money in El Salvador?
Well, it completely transforms it, as you're alluding to, right? So now you've got a wallet from the state, the national government, right, named Chivo, which is in market, right, which, there's a state-owned bank called Banco Hipotecario, right, but what Chivo provides is pretty different from what, the state-owned bank or any other bank operating in country provides, right, and then you've got a whole new set of actors, right, where, what we've created with the Bitcoin Beach Wallet is a community-owned bank, right, that has a is relatively high functioning, right? And then you've got other solutions in country, right, where you've got companies who have partnered with the likes of McDonald's or Starbucks, to provide a smaller sliver of tech stack that still provides point of sale functionality. So we can unpack it, but it's not just like, oh, this is competing with credit cards or, oh, this is competing with a commercial bank. It's kind of all of the above, where you've got all kinds of new competitors that are either a full frontal attack on the existing products in market and banks in market, or just competing from a very narrow angle, but still providing an alternative real product or service that's of value to people. So it's pretty interesting. It's a bit of a complicated matrix, if you will.
Yeah. And now I know in El Salvador, it wasn't necessarily true that everyone had a bank account. I think there was, I don't know what the exact percentage is, but it's a far smaller percentage than what you find in America and Canada. Have you noticed in the last like month or two that anyone who has a bank is now choosing to opt out, or is it just opening opportunities for people without banks to then use financial services and to use Lightning permissionlessly, or is it also taking people from the banking system and moving them onto Lightning just because it's a better experience?
I don't think we're quite at the stage where people are who previously had access to commercial banks or the financial system are opting out of that just yet. But I mean, 70% of Salvadorians, both as individual consumers as well as merchants and small businesses, have never had access to the banking system, right? So it's much more providing access to digital services for people who just never had it before, right? And if you go to El Zante, where the Bitcoin Beach project was born, a lot of people who are using our wallet, it's a guy pushing a cart down this dirt road with, a cart filled with loaves of bread that he sells for 25 cents, right? And like he uses our wallet, it's completely frictionless, it's no cost, it's instant settlement, right? That provides real value to him. There's a reason why that guy is unbanked, because it's not worth the banks to serve him, right? It's not worth a Visa or MasterCard, credit card provider to serve that individual, right? And so, I think over a longer period of time, we will see people opt out into solutions like the one we're bringing to market, but we're not there yet. But it's really much more of a story of, all these millions of people who never had an option other than living their lives on a cash basis now have a real alternative.
Mm-hmm. And so for Galoy, how do you then make it economical? How do you make it make sense to serve these populations that banks could never figure out how to serve profitably, right? Like how do you guys build a business around that, and how do you guys think about the different style or different structure of your business than what you might find at a bank?
Sure. So just to be clear, Galoy, we don't want to be a bank at Galoy. We want to be the number one infrastructure company providing Bitcoin banking as a service, right? So we're a software company that also provides managed services, right? We will support many, many expressions of banks over time, right? But in complete contradiction to that, because all the VCs told us to take a hike in summer of 2020, we created a bank as a proof of concept, right? So to answer your question, we're now actually spinning that out to be its own baby, its own legal entity in country, right, with its own local Salvadoran management team and its own capitalization. And that bank, the Bitcoin Beach wallet, will be a new company, right, that will serve the people in El Salvador. And then to more completely answer your question, we expect that the mobile wallet that consumers use, which is available both on iOS and Google Store, Google Play, that will remain free forevermore. So as a consumer who never had access to banking services, they now have a free digital bank, which is awesome, right, where they can send and receive money on-chain, via Lightning, via username, with other users within the app, right? And then to your question, how do we make money? Well, you do it through, fees that you would charge to businesses and merchants, whether through point of sale solutions, right, competing against credit cards, providing a better experience with a lower price point for the merchant, through bill pay, right? There's basically an internal Western Union in country called Punto Express, where, in a cash economy, people use this where they bring their cash to the local bodega, and then the Punto Express affiliate remits the payment for their utility bill or their water bill or their internet bill electronically, but charges a very hefty fee, something typically on the order of 7%. We can displace that product, right, where you just sit on your sofa, poke your phone, and get charged a much lower fee. So better experience, lower fee there as well. Remittances, like there's a whole product stack on the kind of the commercial business side where we can provide a better experience at a lower fee than the commercial sector does today. And that's where a business like the Bitcoin Beach wallet in country will make money.
And then for Galoy itself, is I guess the different wallet implementations are going to be clients, right, in this banking as a service model?
Exactly. And so the Bitcoin Beach wallet or any other client at Galoy will basically pay what feels like a SaaS fee back to my company, and that's how we make money at Galoy.
Right. Okay. And so in the system right now in El Salvador, with all the different kind of Lightning wallet implementations between Chivo, Bitcoin Beach, and a few others, how do you see the fees kind of unfolding over time? Like how you mentioned like a 7% fee on this transaction and a large fee on this transaction. Is that something that is going to get competed down to zero? Is this something that is going to be, how do these kind of wallets compete with each other? Is it?
I mean, we've seen this in every other sector of financial services, right? Just think about, traditional brokerages in terms of buying stocks, right? Our parents' generation in the 70s or 80s would pick up the phone, right? And they would get charged a couple $100 to buy Disney stock, right? And then things like E-Trade and Schwab went online, and then it was $10, right, online, right? And now, with Betterment and Wealthfront, all these other products, basically it's a race to zero, right? We're going to see a race to zero enabled by Lightning for traditional banking and payment services in El Salvador and in every other country around the world, right? So I don't think it ever goes truly to zero, for the broad population, because people still want a company and a product, or a brand, I should say, standing behind whatever product they're using. If they want a company or brand standing behind that, but it's going to get compressed pretty quickly in terms of the fees. It's going to be awesome to see.
Right. So it'll probably consolidate into a few main players, and those players can kind of like carve out a small fee structure, but something that's at volume large enough to sustain a business.
Exactly. And the flip side is that the operating costs here are much lower, right? Because, think about just the easy thing to get your head around competing against Visa or Amex, right? Visa or Amex works in part because they have a whole network of support and customer service and fraud department, right? That, there's a whole operating overhead that they have, right? That a lot of the competitive products that we and others will introduce in market won't have that same overhead. So even though it's much lower on the revenue side, it's also much lower on the operating cost side. And we'll find an equilibrium there that's just much better for consumers.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. I want to switch gears and talk about the actual Bitcoin Beach specifically, and how that community developed. Because over the last few years, I've heard of a lot of kind of like crypto towns or crypto villages or crypto like pie in the sky, big like, we're going to build this entire ecosystem around crypto. I think one of them may have been, I think the rapper Akon had like an A coin or something like that. He was going to do a village in Africa, or I don't remember the exact details. I think there was one in Vegas too. There have been a lot of these ideas, and basically none of them have come true or like exist today, except Bitcoin Beach. And it did start out as this, like, it was not this like ICO grand scheme, we're going to build this like massive project. It was kind of this ground up, organic initiative. What do you think the reasons are that Bitcoin Beach is having the success it's having today versus like other projects that have kind of been designed, with a crypto, with a coin at the center of it, or some kind of like alternative mechanism for generating value? What do you think the difference has been between the two?
Sure. It's a great question. It's a very easy question to answer. And, it's, on one hand, it may seem cliche, but people make the difference, right? And so, Bitcoin Beach, is a project that started in 2019 in El Zonte, this town on the Pacific coast of El Salvador. And, the heroes of the story are Mike Peterson and Jorge Echeverria. Mike, is a U.S. citizen, who's been probably spending, something like 15 years in El Zonte, right? He's originally, from San Diego. And he's been doing community work, with the kids in the town for the better part of 15 years to keep them out of the gangs and teach them to surf or engage in other productive activities, right? And that's been a big part of Mike's life's work, right? And, Jorge and Echeverria are two, it's easy to call them kids. They're guys in their 30s now, right? Who have known Michael all these years, and they've been working together, right, on all these community programs. And so, the success of Bitcoin Beach is born out of, the God's work that Mike and Jorge and Echeverria have been doing, for many, many years, just in terms of organizing their community, because they care about their people in the town that they live in. And then in 2019, Mike got connected to an anonymous donor who still remains anonymous to this day. It's our limited understanding this is an individual who bought Bitcoin in 2010. It was probably less than $1 and made a relatively, obscene amount of wealth just for having bought Bitcoin early and wanted to do something. And so contacted Mike and said, hey, you're active as a community leader in this town. Why don't you see if you can get a circular Bitcoin economy going? So that started in 2019. And as I mentioned, Mike got written up in Forbes magazine, and I think he was actually on the Tales from the Crypt podcast, right? And that's how Nicholas and I discovered him. And then after we had gotten rejected, Nicholas and I from raising capital in summer of 2020, we just reached out to Mike Cold and said, look, you're using Moon Wallet and Wallet of Satoshi, but it's not really serving your needs. Let us build this bespoke, technological solution for you, right? But to answer your question, like, it comes back to just like Jorge and Shimbera in particular, just educating people one by one, literally taking grandma and their uncle and their friend down the street and saying, hey, look, this Bitcoin thing's not a scam. And hey, you want to download this wallet, and let us take the time to show you how to use this wallet, right? And explain it to you, and then provide a service and give you access to a service that you never had before. And it was literally one by one education that they did with people, hundreds of people, and then eventually thousands of people over a 2-year period of time. That's why this whole thing is a success. Like, we're proud at Galoy of the tech that we created that's expressed in the Bitcoin Beach wallet. But without the work, the educational work that Jorge and Shimbera did day by day for years on end, none of this would have happened.
Yeah, makes sense. And so on top of all this like community engagement work and all the education going into teaching people how Bitcoin works, do you think, how important was the fact that, Lightning solved a real problem for these people? Like, how important was that in the success of Bitcoin Beach specifically?
It's a great question, and I'm smiling because I'm really glad you asked it, because so few people ask us this question, right? And I don't think about it enough. I mean, part of the insight is, even the wallets that people were using in 2019 and, call it the first, even first bits of 2020 before we really got rolling with our wallet, a lot of it was they were trying to do on-chain transactions, right? Which just doesn't work for what we were trying to get going here, right? And so, Lightning was core to the solution that we introduced in the Bitcoin Beach wallet. And part of it was, Nicholas in particular basically lived in El Zante for 4 months straight, right? End of 2020 into 2021. And, we got daily feedback from people saying like, this worked or this broke, or like, would you introduce this feature, right? Like the maps feature that we have in the app where you can see every merchant who accepts Bitcoin. And again, like some of these are mobile merchants, right? We're literally pushing a cart down the street. That was born out of user feedback, right? The username feature was born out of user feedback, right? And so, we kind of learned by doing, by like unleashing something that we didn't fully understand how to build on in terms of Lightning, but you just push it forward, let it break, get the feedback, iterate, and go from there. And so, I mean, that's a long-winded way of saying none of this would have happened without Lightning, because it wouldn't have been, a good user experience and a low-fee user experience for people otherwise.
Right. And on Bitcoin Beach, do you see any patterns in the ways that people are using Lightning? Like, I imagine remittances are a big one, paying merchants are a big one. Is there anything else specifically that people are doing a lot of? Maybe anything that surprised you of the patterns that people are, or the ways in which people are using Lightning today?
Well, I mean, we see, on our back end, we see, all the transactions that happened and the notional value and sats, right? And you can impute, at that point in time on any given day what the notional equivalent in US dollars is, right? But like, we don't actually know what they're doing, right? We don't know whether it's for remittance or a good or service for the most part, right? Now, we have, some qualitative insight just from talking to people in the town and being super tight with Jorge and Shimbera, who like obviously know everybody in the town, right? And we know that the uses have been for goods and services and not for remittance for the most part. But in terms of, are people buying soda instead of meals, or meals instead of a pair of trousers? Like we have no way of knowing that, because it's all pretty private.
Right. Okay. So more so goods than actual remittances.
For sure. Especially, for this calendar year, the vast majority of what's been transacted within the wallet has been for goods and services.
Do you think that's going to change over time? Because that was one of the commonly cited metrics in the early stage of El Salvador stepping up and doing this Bitcoin law, was that 20+% of the country's GDP was remittances, and this was going to be a big improvement over the traditional system. Do you think, is it just Bitcoin Beach Wallet that maybe isn't seeing high remittance volume, or do you think that's true across all of El Salvador?
I think it's true across all of El Salvador. I mean, it's a little bit curious to me why people haven't thought this through. I mean, okay, you just say remittance, but like the remittance has to originate someplace. So there's more than 2 million Salvadorans in the United States, right? But if they're going to send a remittance over Lightning, first of all, they have to understand Lightning. Second of all, they got to get their dirty US dollar fiat money into Bitcoin first, right? And I can assure you that the vast majority of Salvadorians in the United States are not Bitcoiners, right? And they probably don't have an account on Coinbase, right? They probably don't have an account on Kraken or River, right? So the question is like, how do they even get their dollars into Bitcoin in the first place? And so remittance will become, I think, a very important piece of the story over time, but it's a very small piece of the story today.
Right. That makes sense. So since Bitcoin Beach launched, and we've seen the success of it over the last year or so, we've now started to see other projects pop up that are similar in some capacity to Bitcoin Beach. Just to highlight a few, there's Bitcoin Lake in Guatemala, Bitcoin Ikasi in South Africa, Bitcoin Island in Tonga, and Bitcoin Jungle, Costa Rica. Can you talk a bit about those projects? Is Galoy involved? How do they all work? Are they basically replicating the Bitcoin Beach playbook? I'd love to dig into more of that.
Sure. This is where it gets exciting, and this is where I think Galoy is different from in a number of respects. Number one, there's other companies building on Lightning that are building a very narrow piece of tech, right? To my knowledge, there's nobody else trying to build a comprehensive banking solution, right? And so that's what we're building. And if you read the Arcane Lightning research report from November, right, that was like 80 pages long, like all research reports, they got all the logos of the companies grouped in different ways. They didn't know how to group us. They put Galoy in a box by itself called Bitcoin Economy, right? Because we're building a complete suite of Bitcoin banking infrastructure products. That's point number one. Point number two is we're, to my knowledge, basically the only company in the space that's open source, right? We give away our software for free, right? And, we feel that's important for a number of reasons. Number one, and this will tie back to your question eventually if you just bear with me for a second. Number one, it's in line with Satoshi's vision, right? In terms of being open source, peer-to-peer money, right? We're an open source company. Number two, we're dealing with people's money. And last time I checked, money's kind of important to people, right? You don't want to mess around with it. And Lightning is so novel, and things go sideways and break all the time still, not because we or others in the industry don't know what we're doing, but it's just so new, right? And the insight there is you can, work with a company that's opaque and has a black box, right? Or you can work with a company like us where you can use our code, it's fully auditable and transparent, right? And we think because in part Lightning is so new that it's important to be transparent in that way. And so we're an open source company, which gets to your question, where we've got all these expressions of communities that are sprouting up all over the world now, in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America. Some of them are actually using the Bitcoin Beach wallet itself, right? So it's not exclusive to El Salvador. If you're in Guatemala or Honduras or Colombia or Venezuela, you can download the Bitcoin Beach wallet, right? Actually, U.S. citizens are, barred because we don't have a money transmissions license in the U.S., so Apple won't allow us to list the app in the U.S. store, right? But people elsewhere around the world are free to use it and are using it. And Peru is actually one of the countries that has the highest usage after El Salvador. So some of these communities are just using the existing Bitcoin Beach wallet. Others, like Bitcoin Jungle in Costa Rica, which is very exciting, they just went to our source code and stole our source code, which we encourage people to do, right? You don't need our permission. It's free and open source software, right? And they've created their own instance with their own listing of their own novel app in the store, in the App Store, iOS App Store. It's their own app that just got listed this week, or maybe it was last week at soonest, right? Because they had a little bit of delay just running the traps with Apple to get their approval, right? And that's awesome. We want to encourage that. Now, we've been in close communication with the Bitcoin Jungle team over the last 2 weeks. Didn't know they existed 3 weeks ago, and they're probably going to, maybe become a paying client of Galoy because, as I mentioned, deploying the software is so new. It's not just like, hey, take the software and it runs on its own. There's more art than science in terms of managing nodes, in terms of opening and closing channels, managing channel liquidity, rebalancing channels, right? And so, we've got 18 months of expertise of actually running our own software in the wild. And so that's part of our thesis and our business model is, sure, you can take our software and use it for free, and we encourage everybody around the world to do that, but it's often not as simple as just doing that, and then people will probably want to pay for our services over time to lend a hand.
Right. Okay. And so Bitcoin Jungle would this be the first kind of paying client beyond Bitcoin Beach for the Galoy kind of banking as a service business model, or are the other implementations the Bitcoin Island and Bitcoin Ikasi?
Bitcoin Jungle would be the first kind of nonprofit community, right? Because the Bitcoin Jungle team, to my knowledge, they're not looking to make, to profit directly from this, right? They want to bring something valuable to Costa Rica, right? But they're not looking to create a mega for-profit corporation. That said, we do have other paying clients at Galoy, private clients, right? We're building neobanks and other things in formation where we've been working behind the scenes to create, products and services for them that will be launched in Q1 and beyond of next year. So we do have other paying clients, but Bitcoin Jungle is the first kind of open source, largely non-for-profit effort that might become a paying client of ours.
Interesting. Okay, now specifically about the wallet that you've built with Bitcoin Beach, Bitcoiners like to talk a lot about custodial and non-custodial solutions. On your site, you guys have a what you call a shared custody system. Can you explain a little bit about how that works and how it's different and what that means for the people involved in Bitcoin Beach Wallet?
Sure. I mean, on one hand, what we've created is a bit of a novel third way there, and I'll come back to that. To kind of set the table, we truly believe our preference would be to have non-custodial solutions, right? Where the end user holds their own private keys and truly has a self-sovereign solution. The reality is where Lightning is today, it's just not feasible to provide that and have anything that approaches a usable experience, right? So hopefully we'll get there. We as an industry will get there over time. So that's kind of point number one. Point number two is then you can have a custodial solution, right? But that creates all kinds of different risk, either for Galoy or whoever's managing the implementation, right? Different risk, different responsibility, maybe a compliance obligation. What we created with the Bitcoin Beach wallet is, the shared custody model, which really harkens back to the idea of union banking or community banking, which, in my country, the United States, was really prevalent in the 60s and 70s, even into the 80s, before everything became about profit above all. Right? In a community bank, whether it was based around a town or a school, whatever the community was, it was the people's money, right? And maybe there was 10,000 people in the community and they would all put their money in the bank. And then if Mary wanted a loan, right, to open a shop down the street and she was asking for $5,000, the community would come together and said, should we give Mary a loan for $5,000, yay or nay? Because it's our own money, right? That's how community banking used to work. We basically kind of created that same model with the Bitcoin Beach wallet, where it's a multi-sig solution, an M of N solution, right? And we at Galoy only hold one part of the solution, right? So N-1 in terms of the multi-sig setup is held by other trusted members, right? Obviously, for security reasons, we don't disclose who that is, right? And we don't disclose what the number N is. And, there's a bit of intentional privacy here in order to protect the funds of the community. But this works in a high trust situation like in El Zonte, right? El Zonte is not a place where people emigrate, right? It's people who've lived on the same piece of dirt for generations. Everybody knows each other, right? The people of the community, in theory, could collude and run off with their own funds, right? But it is their own funds. They'd be stealing from their aunt and their uncle and their grandma and their brother and their neighbor, right? And so, there's a high degree of trust there, right? To say it differently, I live in Miami. If we just did this, publicly in Miami, you could rest assured the money would be gone the next day because people would collude and figure out how to take the money to Ecuador, right? And so, this shared custody model that we deployed works in high trust situations. It's contextual, right? The context is important, and it can be replicated elsewhere, but it's not for all communities, just to be clear.
Do you think it could ever be for all communities? Do you think it could ever come back to the U.S. and have this kind of community banking system?
Yeah, I think it could, right? For communities that are high trust, it works very, very well, right? A high trust community can be a town. It can be, your extended family, right? And that's what we're building at Galoy. People can't get their heads around the multitude of different client types that we'll serve because there's no analogy, there's no precedent here where we will serve banks and traditional finance companies, right? JP Morgan Chase will come to us some point in the future and white label our services and tech stack. And when you open the Chase app on your phone, it will be Galoy with the powering the app behind the scenes, right? And we will provide solutions for all kinds of companies. Apple and Starbucks will call coming one day, right? They're basically de facto financial institutions. Our friends on the street don't think of Apple as a bank, but it's a de facto bank today, in addition to being a consumer product company, right? So we'll serve them as well. Those are companies. A company is just a group of people for profit, right? We'll also serve communities. Now, people say, oh, Bitcoin Beach Wallet, you just serve towns. We will serve many expressions of towns around the world, but we can serve, your religious organization, your church, your mosque, your temple, your country club, your Rotary club, your sports league, right? And I'm not suggesting that every self-organizing group of people should create their own bank, but with our technology, we're making it easy for anybody who wants to set up their own bank with open source money, be able to do that, right? So you got all kinds of companies we'll serve, we've got all kinds of communities that will serve, the high trust ones, right, where there's high trust amongst the members, can use our shared custody solution. Where there's low trust, shared custody is probably not best for them. And then there's a whole third bucket where things get really weird, which is governments, right? Bitcoin is non-sovereign digital money. Already 13 years into this experiment, we've got sovereign entities, both at the nation state level as well as at the city level, unsolicited, coming to us and saying, hey, Galoy, can you help us figure out how to adopt this non-sovereign money as our own, even though we're a sovereign entity, right? And so this is why it's difficult for people to envision our future, where we will serve all these different client types in different ways, right? And there's different lenses, trust, high trust, low trust, or what's the size of the community? Are they geographically dispersed in all these three different buckets, right? And that's where it gets really weird and interesting in a good way, where there is no analogy in traditional finance for what we're trying to build and will build over time.
Yeah, the last part is fascinating. Having, the idea that someone like El Salvador, the country of El Salvador, could eventually be a client, or you can build a community bank for an entire country. I think that's a really interesting idea that, I agree. A lot of people, including myself, have not kind of fully thought through. And I think that could be a tremendous source of excitement and a brand new narrative around how banks work on Lightning over time. So I want to kind of talk a bit more about El Salvador as a country, because I know you spent a bunch of time over the last few months and years in El Salvador. You did this the Adopting Bitcoin conference in November. What was interest like in November? Have you seen an uptick in just general sentiment in the last month or so since the conference? Do you think that this is going to is it? I know you mentioned at the beginning of the episode that a lot of the banks thought that this was a flash in the pan type scenario. Do you think that the community has come around to that? Outside of the bank executives, do you think the rest of El Salvador now realizes that there's momentum here? Do you think this is are they excited in El Salvador to be building on Lightning? What's the sentiment like since the conference?
Yeah, I think it's useful to keep perspective here. And within the Bitcoin community globally, there's so much excitement and has been, understandably so, about El Salvador. But I think the reality on the ground is a little bit different. Just the general population in terms of individual citizens in El Salvador, most people don't understand Bitcoin, right? Most people associate Bitcoin with Chivo, which is actually a danger, right? Because, Chivo to non-Chivo wallets basically hasn't worked very well, right? Chivo to Chivo works. And so, I think, from just Joe Public on the street in El Salvador, they start to think, okay, I would only use Bitcoin Chivo to Chivo because that's the only thing that works, right? And that actually becomes a real danger and a real threat, where it becomes this kind of closed wall garden, right, where it's only Bitcoin transactions happening with people using Chivo to Chivo wallets. That's not the conversation I want to have, but I want to highlight that reality. That's maybe point number one. Point number two is, there's obviously, as you might imagine now, tremendous awareness with the average person on the street in El Salvador, but most people aren't using Bitcoin, and they're not looking to use Bitcoin, right? And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. It's, this is with all new technologies, right? People, when they don't understand the technology and it's just not convenient for them, they're just going to push it aside until it does become convenient. And all technologies have an adoption curve. When electricity was first invented, people literally thought it was the devil living in the wall, and it was the most dangerous thing, right? And now, more than 100 years later in hindsight, we all see the benefit of technology, right, or of electricity, and we don't question it. But I think Bitcoin in El Salvador or anywhere else will go through a similar phase. And so high awareness, low adoption, but that's not a bad thing where we're at in El Salvador right now. And I think, if anything, kind of tying it all together, the business community is really attuned to Bitcoin right now. And I think, as we head through 2022, you'll start to see, real business adoption of Bitcoin solutions. I mean, the reality is most merchants don't accept Bitcoin today, even though they've had a legal obligation to do so since September 7th, right? It's not like if you go into most merchants and you demand to pay with Bitcoin, a lot of them still just simply won't be able to receive a payment. That'll change, and also like the larger businesses are just taking this much more seriously because, like you said, they realize now it's not a flash in the pan. It's not going away. They have to figure this out, but it's still kind of early all around, whether from a consumer perspective or a business perspective.
Interesting. I had Bernard Para of BitNob on episode 4, and I asked him what he thought might be a game changer for Lightning, and he mentioned stablecoins on Lightning. Do you think that is something that would change people's perspective in El Salvador? Do you think it would add a new use case for people or get people excited in a way that they're not currently with Lightning?
Potentially, yes. I'm hesitant on stablecoins because I think the solution is just to create, maybe this is, just, how do I put this? Here's the short way to put it. People still think in fiat terms, right? In El Salvador, they abandoned their own currency, the colon, 20 years ago. They adopted the dollar. People think in dollars. You know what? I'm an American. I still think in dollars. And people think in dollars or pesos or yen or euros, whatever currency they grew up in and around, right? So that's not going to change quickly, right? Like I think in sats as much as anybody does, and I still think in dollars as well, right? Like you walk into the restaurant, it's priced in dollars, you think in dollars. And so you have to meet people where they're at. Now, whether the solution is a stable coin or just showing them, a very good user experience in an app where it shows them dollars even though they're spending Bitcoin, right? And this is the magic of Bitcoin, right? Where you can be communicating sats over the Lightning Network, but maybe it's displayed as dollars to me, the spender, and displayed as euros or yen to the recipient, right? It doesn't need to be priced in the same thing, right? And so, or the same unit is what I should be saying. And so, whether, I don't know if stablecoin's a solution or it's just a better user experience where people are spending sats but still seeing a price in terms that their mind already understands. That I'm more in the anti-stablecoin camp, but I'm open to the possibility that might be a real solution on Bitcoin.
Interesting. What do you see as what do you think the next catalyst for Bitcoin and Lightning adoption will be?
Well, I hesitate from using other companies' names publicly without, their permission. But I think the seminal moment is when, Jack at Square just decides to enable every Cash App wallet worldwide and every Square merchant terminal to be Lightning enabled, and that could be the most seminal moment any of us hope for any point in the near future, and it might come sooner than people think. And that's going to be seminal. Cash App and Square terminals have a large base, but it's not seminal because of their user base. It's seminal because then every traditional bank CEO around the world says, holy moly, I have no idea what Lightning is. And they raise their hand and says, who can help me figure that out, right? And that's where my company and other companies operating in the space can really shine. And I think that's going to be the seminal moment for Lightning adoption.
Interesting. I like that take.
It's all on Jack's shoulders. No pressure.
No, that's a good take. I have one other question on Lightning applications specifically. Is there anything right now that you're playing with or using personally that you really enjoy? Maybe like a underrated Lightning experience or product that you just enjoy using?
Well, it's less about enjoyment than it is just like there's so much novel stuff there, whether it's like Sphinx and people, who are building communication apps or, podcasting apps where you can stream payments, 10 sats at a time, or, that's what's really cool. We're really proud of the work that we're building at Galoy, and we think it's really important, but on one hand, maybe we're doing the important work, but not the super cool work. Like financial services at the end of the day is kind of boring. And it kind of should be boring, right? You just want it to work and not have to question whether your money's gone through or it's lost or whatever, right? But the really cool stuff I think is happening in terms of, truly enabling freedom of speech and other applications on Lightning, which are not necessarily payment related or banking related. And I think that's an exciting new world that most people can't envision, and a lot of amazing innovation is going to happen there.
How long before we see a Twitter on Lightning?
A while. I mean, I'm not very good at making predictions. I don't think anybody is. I mean, but that's the insight, right? That's going to come. When it comes, tough to predict.
Interesting. Okay. So maybe just to wrap this up, let's talk a little bit about the roadmap for Galoy and what you're kind of excited about working on over the next 6 months, and then where people can find you on Twitter and on your site.
Sure. I mean, quite simply, like I said, we don't want to be the bank. We just want to be the number one institution in the world to make it easy for people to use Bitcoin as money by offering Bitcoin banking services. And so, as I also mentioned, our main constituents are not just companies, which we will serve many different types of, but also communities and also governments, right? And as we head through next year, we know we will serve all three constituent types in many different ways, right? Some of them will be volunteer communities that just sprout up similar to Bitcoin Beach or Bitcoin Jungle, right? Others will be neobanks, which are highly regulated, operating in Europe or elsewhere, right? And so there's going to be many different types of expressions there. So we're pretty excited about just, continuing to build core infrastructure on our side, debugging and refining the infrastructure that we already have in place, and then supporting many different client types at scale as we head through next year, right? I mean, our company, we raised our seed round, which we just announced in July of this year, right? So we were 3 people in June, now we're 16 people. So we're still kind of small and punching above our weight, but it's pretty exciting to think through the products and infrastructure we want to build for next year and all the different client types we want to support. To your question in terms of how people can find us, you can find my company Galoy on the web at galoy.io. That's GALOY.io. We're on Twitter at Galoy Money, and you can find me on Twitter BTC NYC.
Awesome. Thanks so much for the conversation. I really enjoyed it. I learned a ton. And who knows, hope to have you on again sometime soon, maybe to discuss more things as Galoy evolves and as you guys create new partnerships and build out this banking as a service business model.
Sounds great. Thanks for having me, Kevin. Appreciate it.
All right. Welcome to the lightning round. I just published yesterday episode 6 of the Kevin Rooke Show. That was my kind of transcript of the article I had written about the Lightning Network back in November. So I didn't really give you guys much time to send in your questions, but I did get one comment in from at Nick on Fountain. He sent in 1,000 sats and said, great piece of writing. Cool to have the audio version too. Thanks for the sats and the comment, Nick. If you guys have any other questions about today's show, shoot me a message on any Lightning podcasting app. I will get your messages and I will answer them. Any comments, any questions you have on next week's show. Looking forward to reading them.